Good morning and welcome to Primetime. Primetime is at BU Library is a celebration of the experiences and accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It is a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. Most presentations are recorded, can be found in the BU Digital Library. Be sure to check the library's news and events webpage and the BU calendar for what's coming up on the schedule. Join us on Thursday, October 29th, as we welcome Kiersey Fino for an off-campus studies spotlight on her experience with the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs, HECUA, whose focus is on class sessions, hand-on internships, and building community and relationships in the U.S. and abroad. Today we welcome Dr. Seann Dikkers, Associate Professor and Chair of the Education Department, as he discusses how digital media impacts literacy, learning, and living for Christ in digital communities. Okay, welcome, Seann.
Oh, I think I'm mic'd up. There you go. Thanks, Jay, and thanks for the invitation to do this. Upstairs, Linda was saying, well, I'm sorry, I can't make the thing today. And I said, you know, if one or two people show up, usually there's people to have a conversation with. So this is actually a great crowd. And especially with academics, when you say you want to talk about digital video games and learning, that tends to scare a lot of academics away. However, I'm hoping today to start the conversation, or at least to have a conversation about what these spaces look like for those of you that have never been in them before, and talk about participatory cultures and participatory media particularly. So full disclosure, anyone who knows gaming would be able to look at that screen and be impressed. But this is one of my hobbies and has been since I was 10 years old. So this is one of my favorite games, Civilization, and we went on a different profile, but this number right in here is right around 400 hours of playing one particular video game. So for some that's scary and even for me a little humiliating. So at one point in my life I was kind of a closet gamer. And then I discovered there were people interested in research around digital video games and media culture. So we dig into that. Now when I say those terms, let's go back one step. Participatory culture is a term that was coined by a guy named Henry Jenkins out at MIT, and now he's at USC. And what he was looking at as a media and communications scholar was that there were actual cultures forming around these participatory media. Most notably, they had aspects of culture that we recognize when it comes to human face-to-face cultures, like affiliations, expressions, collaborative problem solving, and circulation. In other words, when you're a participant in these gaming communities, part of what gets you status in that community is to be really good at what you do. So if you're a great gamer, you don't just do that privately at your home in a basement in a little dark corner, though you did when I was 10. Since the kind of rise of connected computers, gaming has taken that route, and over the last 10 years has become largely a social activity. So if it's a social activity and I can get good at some sort of performance aspect of my culture, I can then share that with other people and gain status or recognition in that space, or even political power where I control or operate or lead guilds of gamers to solve these massive problems. And the problem solving becomes a collaborative activity. So the key drivers of discussion boards and forum posts were not teachers trying to bring their classes online. Those technologies were developed largely by gamers trying to solve these massive complex problems where the game designers truly don't tell their students the answers. So they would try to figure these out. When they do it, some of the work by Steinkuhler and Duncan actually points to some of that activity being highly scientific. In other words, they took thousands of discussion board posts and they measured that based on the national standards for scientific reasoning, and they found that these gamers were actually conducting themselves like scientists, putting up a hypothesis as to how much damage they're doing to the goblin with this spell versus that spell, and then measuring it out without having any knowledge of how that world works. And then they would go back into the game, test those theories, and argue with each other using argumentation that we would see in a scientific community. So this idea that there's a participatory culture going on is kind of interesting to me. And I'll also say, this is my other little disclosure. Jay said this was not ready for prime time. And I'm actually holding true to this. I would never present this at a conference right now. I'm just not at that point. But I want to see some of these definitions or pieces that I kind of want to bring so that conversation can happen. Because if you want to talk about Pac-Man, I'm not as interested in that. If you want to talk about World of Warcraft, I want to help bring you to that conversation today a little bit. So if these things are true, if Jenkins is right, and Steinkuhler is right, and Jim G is right, and Kurt Squire and these sorts of folks, then when you have a culture, you also have elements of expertise. And if there's expertise, that usually brings influence to that person. If you're really good at carpentry, other carpenters listen to what you have to say. Or if you're really good at photography, people will come read your blog because they want to know how to get better at that craft. If that's true and you can gain influence in these communities, that forms networks. Networks are transmedia. It doesn't matter where you get the expertise. If people are coming to your site to listen to you, you have a soapbox. You have a place where you can talk. And that becomes, and what I would suggest, leads to power. Ultimately, the technical term for this is geekiness. And that was coined by Mimi Ito, also out in California, where she studied over 6,000 hours of youth in digital spaces and found that there was a pattern to learning in those spaces. The first few thousand hours, students will across different games and platforms, they're perfectly comfortable just watching over somebody's shoulder. She called that hanging out. And then students will try things in digital spaces and say, I'm just messing around, right? They won't admit that they're trying, but there's a point at which they say, they geek out. And they say, oh, I'm going to get good at this. I've made this decision that I'm going to be really good at this. So they go from being a hobbyist to an expert. Let me give you some examples of this, and we'll bring it home a little bit. The first example of transmedia storytelling really showed up when the Coen brothers put together the Matrix Trilogy. Now, how many of you have seen all three of these movies? Okay, so that's a moderately good example. I'll give you another one in a bit. How many of you have seen one of these three movies? All right, so most of you saw one of these movies and then kind of lost interest and you didn't come back to see the rest. But there are people that, so you were basically messing around, hanging out, you were in that world, but there are people that geeked out on this story. So if you're really into the Matrix and you want to prove that to me as a fellow geek, you're going to show that expertise by having played the video games, which have storyline that's not in the movies. In fact, there's whole sequences about that guy that brings the bullets in the wheelbarrow. He's a major character in some of these other stories. So the transmedia storytelling kind of continues into books about the Matrix. Librarians in the room should be kind of tuning into this. So this is one of the pathways that we're seeing in education, that you can bring non-interested readers into the world of reading, is to hook into their transmedia spaces. Not only that, but artists have come and joined and tried to make alternative stories using completely different art sequences. There's forum posts and conversations about this world. And to be a real geek in the Matrix, you need to have done all of it and have your foot in all of these communities to gain expertise, influence, networks, and power in this space. And there are people that direct and lead this conversation. Here's another example. My son will like this one. By the way, my son's trying to distract you off to the side. So if you are hanging around afterwards and want to see what some of these worlds look like, he's online right now with about 2,000 people. And he's just running around and whatnot. So if you can turn your brightness all the way up, Fran, that'd be great. It used to be, when I was a wee lad, that if you were interested in these characters, you had to go get the comic book, right? But both Marvel and DC have found out that there's other media you can deliver story through. And that media becomes really compelling, especially when you bring those things to the movies, which are a form of media. Another way to try to bring that story across is through action figures and more sales. So this could just be a marketing scheme, but I'm not in business and marketing. I'm way over here in education. So this becomes interesting to me when these things then also go into a form of media called computer games, where there's stories being told about these characters that people like. And if you want to be treated as someone that's an expert in this area, a true geek of superheroes, you need to then kind of understand what those spaces look like. In addition, there's message boards, discussions, conversations, alternative history or alternative literature being written about these characters. And lo and behold, there are actually some TV shows that that you can see these characters showing up in completely other genres. And The Simpsons is one of these areas where Steven Johnson wrote a book called Everything That's Bad for You is Good for You. And he looked very carefully at The Simpsons and realized that in every episode of The Simpsons, there are multiple references to completely other narrative arcs. And that if you don't know those references, you really don't enjoy the show as much. In addition, We can connect this into even to our news services or moderate comedy news services, which those lines are starting to blur. So in a world of transmedia storytelling, where those lines are blurring all over the place, this becomes kind of an interesting thing. How many of you play fantasy anything? And will admit it. Let's take a real careful look as people that might be interested in teaching and learning. Let's look at what really happens inside of fantasy football. If you are just a passive fantasy football player, you can just go to the draft, pick your people, and have fun and let your team just kind of die on the vine throughout the year. That would be hanging out. You're just doing it for your friends. Or you can mess around with it and kind of try some things, switch out your team every week, and figure out what you're doing. But the digital era has really ramped up the ability to get every piece of data on your favorite players. So this is connecting a little more to the real world than comic book characters does. But it's the same principle, that I can go across different forms of media and access the things that I'm interested in. Now math teachers get interested when it starts to look like this. And what I'm really doing is weighing out, making mathematical estimations as to which players will perform in a given week, using variables that are countless, including what weather it is on a given day. So geeks of fantasy football have gone all in. They've created their own apps, their own tools, their own devices, and even entered into the world of gambling a little bit. You can do some of that. But when these things start to happen, and I can even put these things on my cell phone, I can instantly have access to my mathematics everywhere I go and have fun with it. Now, fun's a naughty word to some people in education. We don't want to necessarily have fun when we learn. But my question is, and some of these questions are going, can learning be more fun than it is? And the answer is absolutely. People pay money to do this. And in school, we have to beg them to do math. As a former social studies teacher, I get interested when I start to see maps, charts, and graphs being used around fantasy sports and fantasy predictors. Some of you might even know the names of these players, right? Where they're trying to do estimations and likelihoods. Valuable data that's predictive and invaluable data that's not predictive. And these kinds of tools and techniques. Even as a health teacher, starting to know what and learning the vocabulary around different injuries, that makes a big difference if somebody's injured their knee versus their quad, right? As to when they're going to be back playing and whether or not you want to drop them off your team or keep them. Moreover, Phi Ed teachers have started to look at this kind of media and this kind of quote-unquote storytelling to try to create narratives that students can have their own avatar and look at their own physical behaviors and their own actions throughout their lives. Tools like this little Fitbit can actually change my behavior if I'm competing with my wife, which I am. And today, I'm losing. Those are interesting. So that's what I mean when I talk about transmedia storytelling. And my question today is, what about those spaces that we haven't heard of because we're really not in those digital worlds, right? So one of the things Grant's doing right now is he's running around a world, an entire city in Rift, and he's doing crafting. No, you're buying things.
Yeah, I want to see the quarterback.
Whose credit card are you using?
Yours.
Okay. But what about digital participatory cultures? What about those invisible cultures that we haven't heard of? So I want to give you some kind of examples of that and show you some of the statistics around video games and what they look like. And then I kind of want to ask the question about, well, what does our faith look like in these spaces? Or is it not in these spaces? First, let me talk about MMORPGs. Does anybody know what that stands for? Yes. Yeah.
It's like massive online role-playing games. I forgot what the other M stands for.
So massively multiplayer online role-playing games. If you haven't heard of these, if I say World of Warcraft, you probably have. They're not simple spaces to get into and be active. Now, World of Warcraft has some of the best instructional design I've ever seen. The first hour of World of Warcraft tells you where to walk, little question marks and exclamation points over characters' heads. It enters you in very easily because they know that people might just be messing around. And after about the first hour of play, they introduce you to spaces where there's other players running around with really fancy looking armor. And they're trying to lure you into doing more than just messing around. In fact, they give you the first 20 levels for free. You can just mess around in World of Warcraft and try it out tonight for nothing. But the way they make their money, and it's a sizable amount of money, is that after you get done with the first few levels and you decide, I really like this community, I want to hang out here, I want to maybe even geek out on this, is that they start to slowly introduce you to more buttons, more tools. These are different players that you would be playing with in an environment. That's a big, ugly, two-headed dog monster thing that you're trying to beat. This is your small unit that you're playing with health bars, life bars, energy bars, depending on which kind of characters you have. So different characters have different abilities. And you actually have to work together in these games to get things done. Now, as an educator, that's interesting. What does group work look like in digital spaces? It looks highly stimulating and awfully confusing. So you have to geek out to get good at these things. But these are very different than our classrooms where we need everyone to participate. We can't afford to have people not geek out. So I start looking back at this kind of equation, and what does it look like for educators to start thinking about expertise, networks, and influence in digital spaces that could be part of a learning experience? There's been some wonderful research, as a side note, done on World of Warcraft 2, where they're not only looking at science habits, but they're looking at the amount of reading that has to happen for people to play these games. And it's volumes of reading. Most geeked out World of Warcraft players have read the equivalent to the entire works of Shakespeare, both in online forum posts, YouTube clips, but also reading and writing their own material around that game. And just to get through the quest content into the game and these little single-tiled quests, the volumes of information they have to get through to level their character all the way up to the high level is sizable. So that's interesting to me. These are the pieces that I'm interested in as an educator. Moreover, those are massive multiplayer games, so a huge roadblock. As a teacher with FERPA law and stuff, I can't drop a classroom full of students into World of Warcraft. Though there are teachers that have, and they've worked with their district to figure it out. One great example of that is an English teacher in North Carolina that lets their students play once a week for 45 minutes. They can play WoW. And he sends a bell every 10 minutes. This sounds kind of Pavlovian, but hold on for a second. They ring a bell every 10 minutes, and students have to stop what they're doing in the game and tweet themselves what they're doing in the game. When they come back to class the next day, they use their tweets to write their stories. And then as they start writing their novels, they have to go back and do the grammar to make sure their grammar is accurate, and they have to do storytelling and learn how to do description, and they have to do all of that by having the stimulant of the game be the initial part of what draws the interest. So they're actually using these kinds of participatory cultures to stimulate writing in their classroom. I'm more interested in a limited multiplayer online environment where I as a teacher can control and just have my class be in the space. And there happens to be one of these games that just came out. A guy broke off from a large game company and just started coding at home, and he made the worst looking game ever. It goes back about a decade when it comes to graphics, but it's a limited multiplayer environment, and I can pick up anything in the world, and I can put it down wherever I want to. Simple sandbox style game, right? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Minecraft. So Grant can go ahead and make that transition. If you haven't seen Minecraft before, Grant will have it up on the computer soon. It's not very stimulating compared to WoW, right? In fact, there's almost no interface on the screen when you get into this game. Well, what's interesting about it is that you can go with your friends and you can start to build things. This is my first little house in this space. But then when you build things, you realize, wow, I can use different materials. And then you start to think, maybe I could do something huge. And then this is about the first evening of play, and then you realize that looks horrible. Maybe we could organize and plan and take that German castle we've seen in the pictures so much, and we could do that. And then it gets bigger. So this is something that kind of lures you in slowly. Again, it starts with just messing around, and then you're kind of like, I could hang out in this space for a while. And then it gets even worse. Then you do your first major thing, and you feel this pride, like, wow, we did it. That looks pretty cool. And now I can go inside that castle I've always seen in the pictures. But we can also start to think in terms of, what does this look like for doing world monuments? Or taking the stories that we read and building those out into really big projects that we would use. So those kinds of things are interesting. What if we could start to plan future cities, which was this month's Wired magazine, was how we're doing city conception and thinking. Well, part of that thinking is happening in Minecraft. How do we build cities of the future that are ecologically friendly? We have to have spaces to play with that and do that. This has given rise to maker spaces. Jay, I'm putting this pitch in for you. Jay's been overseeing a project trying to build one of these spaces here, but it's not just about what you do in the digital space, it's how does that digital space become part of the real fabrication space? How can we make these things into models? I can take any object in Minecraft and pull that file out easily, and I can put it on a 3D printer and print it. So I can take my dreams and actually make them into physical objects and show them to my teacher. So this book is 17 different teachers using this across the curriculum and across grade levels to try to take this product to build it. That's not what we're talking about today. Minecraft just bought this product that's been out for a long time, for $2 billion. I'll say that again, $2 billion for this product that's been on the market for a long time. Now, like a movie, most games will get worth less after they're out on the market. Minecraft's done the opposite. It's gained value after it's hit the market because it's a participatory space where you can build community and culture. And they're seeing that happening. The goal is to follow the example of Northern Ireland, Norway, and Sweden, where every student at kindergarten age gets a Minecraft account. They get their textbook, they get their laptop, they get a Minecraft account. And teachers can just use that as part of the classroom. Microsoft would like to see that happen in the United States. So Minecraft in schools. So this is, hopefully we've taken this journey through participatory media and transmedia culture, and part of your brain says, wow, that's kind of exciting. But for me, and this is my first year here at Bethel, by the way, so I'm really nervous right now, but thanks for coming for this. There's that Christian part of me. And I keep thinking, well, wait a second. If these are such valuable spaces where I can learn how to network, connect with people online, build influence, and actually have authority and power, and then a soapbox where I can influence other people, maybe on how they vote. So when you're in World of Warcraft and you get bored, you start talking politics. You start talking religion. You start talking about all those things that people used to talk about in the bowling alley or at the quilting club. Right? These are participatory spaces. It's what you bring to that space that makes it valuable. Because bowling is kind of dumb, right? And so is most computer games. I'll admit it. They're kind of silly. But it's what people bring to that space that make them so compelling and interesting. It is not the graphics of Minecraft that make it so interesting. It's that I can run up to my parents and show them what I made, only they can't hang it on a fridge anymore. And that's the part that becomes really compelling for almost 25 million players. If you don't know a Minecraft player, ask a kid. And it might be something they're just not sharing. Here's my question though, and it's a question that's becoming more and more common across the literature. If all that's the case, then we have a participation gap. There are some students that have access to this at home that are well parented, where their parents give them limitations. Like, no, you can't play for 12 hours on a Saturday. And they start to learn balance in their life, and they can start to control these spaces. And then we have students coming to college freshman year that can't stop playing because they don't have limits anymore. And they start getting bad grades in class, and they realize that their life's out of balance. Here's the other piece that's shocking. In 2011, we hit a key number. We're never going to get the last 3% because we're talking about people that refuse to have computers in their home, right? In Ohio, we have the Amish communities. They're not going to be part of this statistic. 97% of American youth today play some sort of online video game or participatory culture. They're either sharing their Fitbit information with each other, or they're actually in an MMO playing games once a week with their friends, or Call of Duty, that kind of thing. So I start with a question, can learning be a participatory culture? I'll give you one more example that I think is really interesting. And I tried to give examples across different discipline areas. This is a game called Fold It. It's not very interesting other than that you got to try to bend that in two and make a match. And for geneticists and biologists in the room, they'll know that if I can match a virus and make a perfect mirror to it, I can make an antivirus. So they took common known viruses and they put them online, and they let guilds of players try to figure out how to fold them most efficiently and to make the most effective antiviruses. So you can mess around here and play 1 or 2 levels in an evening for free, but the people that geek out on this will spend entire weekends figuring this out. And when scientists put up the new virus that they're working on, entire guilds of adult players will jump in and try to figure this out first so that they have status, expertise, influence, and power. The result is, in 2011, they had a breakthrough, and they solved the first and most simple of the AIDS viruses, and they found a fold to it. So this is gaming culture having real influence on the world. I think that's kind of interesting. And in schools that becomes relevant, and I'm not the first to ask that question, what do 21st century schools look like? Even though we're 2 decades in now, we're in our 2nd decade, still asking that. Jane McGonigal asked, what does psychology look like if we create games for people to get through depression? And if you're interested in that, there's a book called Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal. The entire Chicago library system has redesigned their libraries to be more like a gamer space where they account for messing around, hanging out, and geeking out, and they have spaces for each of those 3 activities. So they've thought through their libraries architecturally to do that, and lo, kids started to stop by after school. And this became a safe place for them to hang out. Notice, just so I don't offend librarians, at the middle of this space are books that just can be picked up and read, where you can geek around. Rochester Institute of Technology's undergraduate program issues every student a Just Press Play near field identification unit, which is a really small version of the GPS in your phone, where I can go to a professor's office and I can swipe my thing and I actually get points for stopping by a professor's office. Every one of 120 different activities that they put into their game were things that statistically in the research they knew would increase the likelihood of that student's graduation. So not knowing the causality of things, they knew the relation that if you stop by a prof's office, you are statistically more likely to finish your time at RIT. So they put it into the game. And they started to have students or recruit students just because their entire 4-year college experience became a game-like activity that they could participate in and compare their notes with their friends. Quest Atlantis is another version of that where you can get into a world like what Grant's doing and actually play through an environmental problem in a small town. And while you're doing it, you're actually doing your science class. So that's the appropriation of games for learning. But there's a darker side to this for me. What if schools just become little dark rooms with glowing screens? Is that what we want? And though, full disclosure, in my own classes, I love these kinds of spaces. There are glowing screens, but there's also writable walls like we have downstairs, right? This creates complex problem solving that is the golden nugget in education. How do we get people to do more critical thinking and complex problem solving? And these things can be organized, and we can have analysis and evaluation that starts in. Not only that, we can digitize these kinds of problems and spaces. So a lot of my work's been in mobile media. How do we get learning to happen outside of the classroom? Quest to Learn's a school in New York where the entire school, starting with middle school, and they've added grades now, and I think they're a 5-12 school at this point. Their test scores are not significantly different from traditional school systems, but they go in shorter units, and then they have what they call a boss fight at the end of 7 weeks. And they have a 2-week project where they give students a problem, and they don't tell them the answer. They give them 2 weeks in teams to figure out their problems. This is a common question in the field right now, and there are many people writing about how video games can affect the learning process, the design of learning systems, how video games can be made for learning, and how video games can be borrowed or stolen for learning, right? So those sorts of things come out. And again, I'll confess, this has been my publication history, is that I've been working through these questions. But as a believer, I keep coming back to that. What if this is all a really, really bad idea? And so I started looking for bad ideas out there, and this is the best one I could come up with. What if the use of technology is actually not what we should be pursuing just because it's technology? Does that mean we should be using it? Should we be teaching our teachers how to adapt, how to appropriate, how to integrate, how to design schools and systems around these things? Are we simply putting carrots in front of human beings and expecting them to bite? And is there a point where the honeymoon will be over and our youth will see through this thin veil that we've created, where we're hanging carrots in front of them because we're so reliant on external motivations that when left in a room by themselves, students no longer know how to motivate themselves? It's gone. And if that's the case, am I actually serving the wrong kingdom when I write about, talk about, and study these kinds of things? To be fair, the Christian community has jumped in. To be fair, the gamers in this audience just smiled because it's really painful to see this kind of thing. When Christian music first started out, I'm going back in my history, it was kind of painful to listen to the early Christian musicians copy the mainstream musicians. But today, there's entire radio stations around it. to be fair, the first Christian movies were really hard to watch. And the Christian movie industry has gotten to be better and better at storytelling and using that form of media to create great product. Now, I still want a war game where I get to be David and conquer all the civilizations around me. They haven't made that game yet. And in part, it's because as believers look at the computer game industry, we have some challenges too, not just as the game industry looks at education. But what if well, this isn't a what if, by the way, this is a real game. This is Left Behind Eternal Forces, and your job is to go around, and it looks an awful lot like the secular world games, where this makes me cringe a little bit, right? So as a believer, like, do we know this media well enough not only to make great games, but to make games that aren't kind of offensive at the same time? Like, do you really want a game about how to pray? And is that something we want to put in external motivations around? So these are my questions. I told Jay this isn't ready for prime time. Normally at the end of these talks, I have solutions. Like, let me suggest, here's all these problems, let's figure this out. But the reality is I don't have a lot of solutions, and Jay promised me this was a safe place to ask some of these questions. So one question is, will Christian media get better in time? Who will God raise up to do this? Is God right now waiting on putting a Holy Spirit on a game designer somewhere out there? So maybe the person that just made Grand Theft Auto 5, maybe God's working on their heart. And we have great game designers that are starting to be compelled to rethink what they're making and why they're making it. So initially, Grand Theft Auto was to mock the United States violence system, and then the game sold really well. And then they started making more and more of them, and today it's kind of like mainstream gaming culture, right? And I'm using the worst case example. Most people don't like that game because of all the content it has in it. But there aren't really alternatives for a great immersive space where I can go run around Gangland LA, right? Or if I want to run around and kill orcs and dragons, there are games out there to do that, but I'm usually just running it around so that I can pack my digital pockets full of gold. In fact, the real world economy of when I sell you my digital item on eBay, that economy is bigger than most third world nations. So we have entire companies in China that just put players in digital spaces to accumulate things while we do real work, and then they sell things on eBay, and that's the business. So these digital spaces have economic impact and influence. At what point is that conversation going to shift? Because right now there is no Christian gaming industry. In fact, and I asked librarians about this earlier, we don't even have a gaming section in this library. And those are increasingly becoming more part of library spaces, but we don't even think of games as a form of media that is competitive with movies, music, books. And in reality, the gaming industry, as of 5 years ago, outsold all three of those media combined. So the gaming industry is bigger than Hollywood, and it's bigger than Nashville. And you can put them together, and there's more money in games than there is in any other form of media. Yet in a Christian community, are we even playing them? Do we even know what's happening in those spaces? Can we put our own convictions aside long enough to see what's going on inside a game like Grand Theft Auto? Or are we barking about those things in such a way that we look like fools? And I'm putting that bluntly, but Jay said this was not ready for prime time, so I'm hoping to maybe offend and activate a conversation. Should Christians be thoughtfully active in these participatory cultures? Is there a mission world here? If you have 20 million people playing World of Warcraft, should there be an outreach program for World of Warcraft where Christians enter into these spaces where people actually are spending their time? Or are we so reliant on face-to-face ministries that can you minister in a digital space? Told you I had more questions than answers, Jay. Is Christianity itself a participatory culture? And does this theoretical framework give us a way to think about our own behavior in a way that we exclude non-believers? So if there's a language to Christianity that we share, and if you're not a Christian, you don't even speak our language, right? That's a simple example of that. But what happens when you come into a church? Have we so formed cultures in those spaces that we've forgotten what hanging out and messing around looks like in the church? Do we have spaces for those kinds of believers that haven't geeked out on Jesus yet? And are they welcome? And are we encouraging them to come in and invite? I can say from my experience with digital media is that does happen in good participatory cultures. There are experts that bring the novices along and mentor them and share that experience. Or are we expecting that people geek out before they've had a chance to toy with ideas? And if so, where do we spend time doing that in our society and our culture anymore? If we don't have bowling leagues and we have World of Warcraft leagues, where do adults and where do experts and novices even meet each other in our culture anymore? If 97% of American youth are spending some of their time at least in digital spaces, do they ever see Jesus in those spaces? Or better yet, do they ever meet a mature believer in those spaces? This even begs the question, should mature believers be in game spaces at all? And I'll confess my game time has shrunk the more mature I've gotten as a believer because I got other things to do. Should or do Christians have a transmedia presence? Do we think about the delivery of the message of Jesus Christ not just on the radio, but across media? And I would suggest that that's happening to some degree, but the Christian movie makers are completely independent of the Christian novel writers and the Christian game designers, if there are any, and the Christian theorists and academics and scholars that, remember those examples of Marvel and the Matrix and fantasy football, where that media goes across different media formats? That's one of the fine arts that the world of media is developing and forming right now. They know how to take a story and put it in a movie, a computer game, a book, and across these different things. And are we as believers learning how to take great Christian movies and turn them into video games that don't offend half of our Christian community, right? I can think of so many bad ideas for Christian computer games, but I won't do that because that's more antagonistic. So these are the kinds of questions I have, and I want to thank you for coming. We actually have some time left. Yes, Jay? If any of you think you might have ideas or answers to some of these questions, I told Jay probably the best part about this kind of a time would be to hear from intelligent Christian students and scholars about how you might answer some of these questions and hopefully have that conversation. So I'll open it up to the audience.
I don't think this was not a Christian company, and I apologize for not remembering the name of my son, Nathan. Played a game that by design sets you up, and by the end of the game you figure out that they've lured you into making all of the ethically wrong decisions and put that right up into your face at the end of the game and say, these are the choices you made and now here are the consequences. And it was a very deliberate, just makes it absolutely easy to do all the right things and think you're doing the right things.
Right. The games industry has clearly matured in the last 10 years, where you could say there's low culture and high culture. And high culture is respected by people like us, but low culture is respected by the 13-year-olds. And as the game designers have grown older, they've started to make games that really question those decisions. There's a game that just came out that has real death in it. If you die, the game is gone. You can never play that character ever again. The game I might take some guesses at the game you're talking about, but it reminds me of games like The War in Us, where you're not playing a soldier in a battle, you're actually playing the victims, and you're trying to survive a battle happening in your town.
This is the one with you found the last person you're supposed to transport to stop this terrorist.
If you remember it, yes,
I'd have
send it
to-
my way. But there's a number of games now that are asking those high ethical questions. I would argue that those games that the designer of the game has a worldview that is embedded in those games. So even in those kinds of environments, is there an active conversation that includes a Christian worldview? And most of those worldviews are arguably not entirely Christian worldviews. So what they consider to be right and wrong answers is a little different than what a Christian might say is a right and wrong answer. But they're training this generation of youth who plays those games. That's where the ethical questions are being asked for this generation. At least that's what I'm arguing. But it's good.
Well, I mean, I had a couple thoughts. You know, as a librarian, or just thinking about in general how popular culture gets adapted and as a focus of study. So comic books, you know, like an older one that was considered sort of throw off popular culture, and
Low
now
culture.
it's become more of a serious study. So looking at that, and then even just multimedia, online media, sort of, I think there's that progression. And so some libraries, like even like Roseville Public Library, they actually have video games for people to check out. So also, it's a library has to adjust to what the community, the economics, the social environment can support. So makerspaces are exciting to think about, but do we have the economics to provide those kind of tools for people to experiment with?
Right.
Because I think part of your questions, it's participatory. So partly to better engage in the environment, you have to know it, right? So you have to be a consumer, and then if you're going to craft it, you have to know how to build into it, and then even so contribute, but also then build your own. So I mean, some of those questions are definitely good ones, and thinking about what's the social, economic environment that is your context.
Minecraft, after-school Minecraft clubs are becoming more and more prolific or populating different schools. And one of the teachers I interviewed for the book simply put up a poster in the school that said, anybody interested in Minecraft club, let us know. They had over 200 students that wanted to stay after school and play Minecraft. Now, if that's in a proctored space with a teacher, I think that might be more valuable than just going home and playing in the wild. However, I think students are tuned into how much are we colonizing their space too. And don't take my game and make it into your school. And that can be a really kind of almost a visceral reaction when you talk to young people about those kinds of possibilities. However, as teachers, we've done that with movies, and we've done that with, we love to colonize those kinds of spaces because we care about learning and we want students to be interested in it. And to do that thoughtfully is really tough. I would also argue that makerspaces are not necessarily expensive to start. It's simply an interested participatory community. And a lot of times you can get parent-teacher organizations to donate, you can get alumni groups to start. But really all you need to start is 4 or 5 computers in a room and some paper. And you can start doing those kinds of activities where you're building and challenging. Toothpicks and marshmallows and building the highest tower possible in 10 minutes is a great makerspace activity. Let's go and see who can figure these things out the best. So it reminds me of Destination Imagination, Fantasy in the Mind, those kinds of programs.
I feel like that what you were just saying kind of relates to the question about Christians thoughtfully participating in those cultures. Just gaming culture can be, you may have gathered from my reactions that I participate in certain ones of those, and it is a pretty toxic culture on the whole. A lot of the massive online games, because people don't have to deal with the face-to-face interactions, and so it can be, I think, a very difficult space to move into if you have ministry in mind, at least in game. My guild might be a little bit of a pretentiously geeky word, but the people that I game with regularly, there's a Christian, there's a gal who's Baha'i, there's a Muslim guy, there's an agnostic guy. And so we have lots of discussions outside of the game. We're friends outside of the game, so those do together. But in game, it just seems like that would be. Yeah, it seems like it's like, how does the sort of the toxicity of the gaming culture affect some of the things that you're thinking about with constructive use of that space, because people don't have to take each other seriously and deal with the consequences of what if you said that or did that to somebody.
For those in the room that don't know what he means by a toxic culture online, first of all, when you're involved, it does feel like a culture, right? So even on the discussion board, you get to know people and you have respect for them or not based on things they've done in the past. So there is a network and a power structure there. And who's needed in your guild and who's not, so you can remove people if they're annoying. But there's actually vocabulary around that too. So if you go online and you run into somebody who's particularly toxic, they're called trolls. And trolls are people that you can usually excommunicate from your community, but some games you can't. And they just get on another character and continue to be annoying. And they're horrible and they're abusive and they use language that would make us blush, right? And Christians in those spaces either have to shut off their Christianity in order to play the game, or they have to be bold with their Christianity. So I've also seen Christians in those worlds that can be the trolls. right? So they're coming into these games with the intent of shoving their belief down other people's throats. And they're not well appreciated in these game spaces because they're not people that know the culture. So it's the real life equivalent of walking into a business office with your Bible and starting to preach the gospel in the middle of their lobby. Like, that's not where you do that. There's rules. There's unspoken rules in game culture. So you almost need Christian gamers to be immersed in the culture enough to know what those norms and etiquettes are that are part of that culture in order to gracefully bring your faith into those conversations. So take them offline is what I would say is transmedia, right? You're building friendships in one space, but those friendships result in relationships in other spaces. Do you ever travel and meet guildies in real life when you go on trips?
One's coming for my brother's birthday.
Right, so they actually turn into real life relationships too. And Match.com and some of these map pairing services, and they're showing statistical validity and advertising for what they do. So we are talking about real world relationships too. And I think that being a believer in those spaces takes grace, takes thoughtfulness, takes etiquette. So, but yeah, they're it's like the Wild West when you get into some of these spaces, and that's what you're talking about, these toxic cultures. And so as Christians, are we willing to go into a toxic culture and trust that our God can help us to bring some, what would be the right word for that, sobriety to those environments? To coach, to mentor, and to do that you have to be an expert. Or you're not listened to. You're not someone who's respected in those spaces. So hours and hours and hours of time to do that. We have young people that are playing computer games all over the place. Bethel is full of gamers, but there isn't a common community or conversation where they can even know what each other's playing, right? And where they can start to build those communities. The Bible says you're going to know them by how they treat each other. So believers and how we act with each other is part of our ministry to the world. So do digital gamers get to see how Christians game together? Is there excellence and expertise and rigor in what we do? Are we talking and communicating at scientific levels of discovery in these spaces? Are we the best gamers out there where people would want to see how we do things just because we're good at what we do? And I think Bethel has a long tradition of answering all those questions in positive. That yes, we should be the best educators so that people want to know what makes you such a good educator. Or the best scientists, that rigor is part of what we're all about. The toxic culture piece, I would argue, I mean, you've seen it, but it is definitely, you're going into an area that is largely religion-free. And people are adamant about keeping it that way. They don't want religion in those spaces. Is that fair to say? And it's almost the same as they don't want education in those spaces either. But we have a lot of people trying to figure that out. Good conversations. I don't have answers for any of it. So. Other thoughts?
Thank you so much, Seann.
Thanks.
Amazing presentation. Thanks, everybody.
And if you want to get a better look at Minecraft, come on up. Grant can talk you through it and tell you what he's up to and what he's building and what he's doing in there, and you can get a look at that.